Hi, Summer May Finlay here, talking to you about human services and policy development. And today we're specifically going to focus on human services. So this is workshop 3, lecture 3 in week 6. Before I go any further, of course, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today. As a Yorta Yorta woman, this is not my country. I am eternally grateful for those that have come before me, that have looked after this country, and for those that continue to look after this country. As I said, we're talking about funding and governance in Australian human services. We're going to be looking at mostly the current system. But before the 1990s, the welfare state model was actually delivered primarily by governments and non-government organisations, NGOs. So what this meant that governments set the broader policy direction. This could be through legislation or through other mechanisms like frameworks and policies. And then funding was allocated to the appropriate Australian Public Service Agency, such as the Department of Health and Ageing and Department of Social Services, to state and territory governments, local governments, and as I said, non-government organisations to be able to deliver and meet the needs as described in this policy direction. There were some perceived challenges with the welfare model, though. It meant that the public service was very, very large and was responsible for delivering a large number of services. It was then critiqued for having long wait lists and variable access because of the limited funding and the high demand. This meant that there was a huge cost, particularly for infrastructure, for state governments to maintain nursing home buildings, group homes, community transport buses. It was also critiqued for not being consumer focused, so it was a one-size-fits-all type approach. These criticisms led to a move to contractualism and new public management in the mid-1990s, which is a competitive tendering model, and this is the model we use today. What this means is governments are outsourcing the social services through a competitive tendering. Now, what this means in practice is that services can be tendered either through a closed tender, so only certain organisations can tender for this particular service delivery, or it's an open tender. And potential grantees have to respond to the grant opportunity guidelines, and then a selection process is undertaken and the grant is awarded. And this is underpinned by a neoliberal public choice ideology. So the idea that a competitive market would actually see greater consumer choice. So this meant that governments, while they were outsourcing provisions, still got to determine what they want, how it was delivered, why it was delivered, and the budget. They then got to determine the outputs, outcomes, reporting, and evaluation. And contracts specified all of these approaches, including the outcomes and expected quality of services. So while the government was outsourcing this approach, these services, they were absolutely maintaining a huge control. So from the 1990s onwards, government regulation of human services was tended to focus on efficiency and productivity, which is what they thought was going to be achieved by a competitive tender. This neoliberal approach has sought to downsize the state government's role and focus particularly on the role that the market and private sector and not-for-profits, including NGOs, can play. So government outsourcing arrangements are underpinned by the purchaser-provider split under the public choice theory that promotes that government should scale down the public sector, contract out service delivery, and produce competitive market models in the public sector. However, this model doesn't always work. There are critiques. So it cannot be effectively be used outside the economics. And in a social context, it fails to take into consideration people, how we operate, our biology, our motivations, the social and psychological aspects, as well as individual needs and issues relating to power. The human service adoption into policy process was designed to promote individual self-determination and minimise welfare dependency. So what this allowed was that consumers as an individual would be able to make an informed choice about what was going to be in their best interest. And this is to promote the notion of user pays. So for example, we know with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, if you are a recipient of that, you will have a budget and you'll have to manage that budget in line with what is allowed to be included in your budget. So, for example, if you've got a physical disability and it might be that you need a wheelchair, you're allowed to spend money and choose where that wheelchair is bought from within the terms of your contract. You'll also be able to choose the provider for your physical services. So that might be things like a physio. So that might be a for-profit physio. So you can choose to go to a for-profit or go to the local non-government organisation like the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service and receive your service there. There are problems, however, with competitive tendering when it comes to social welfare policy. It threatens equity. It means that people with complex and diverse needs often aren't getting met. And it also means that people where there is no market, often in rural and remote communities, do not get services because they're not profitable for businesses and there is no market. The notion of service user as an active consumer is problematic, as it really does narrow down the choices that people have. And people may not necessarily therefore have the opportunity to make a choice and make a decision. It then's changing the relationship between governments and third sector organisations, where it's become that funder and service provider. So the nature of that relationship means that often NGOs feel less likely to be able to advocate for their clients for fear of losing their funding. Human service providers, such as social workers, may face dilemmas when seeking to optimise social service outcomes for people under the third sector organisations, because they, again, may not feel like they can advocate as strongly because their organisation is dependent on government funding. They may also find there are limited choices because of this notion of private sector being a competitive market. And if there is no market, there are no services. When we're thinking about this contractualism, there are some considerations. The core business of welfare is to provide social services to people who need it. Therefore, there is a conflicting ideology often between non-government organisations and state service providers and for-profit service providers. So when we're looking at ideologies, NGOs are often designed to be empowering. They are designed to be consumer and community focused, and state providers are often then looking at efficiency and effectiveness. Now, that may not necessarily be the primary motivation of an NGO, and the for-profits providers are driving for profit, as they say, and we've seen this be particularly challenging in the aged care sector. So the for-profit organisations, particularly during COVID, were not deemed to be particularly safe, and they did have higher rates of COVID infections and mortality because of what was perceived to be a drive for profits, i.e. they didn't have enough nurses on site, the quality of the food wasn't appropriate, etc. There are also implications for smaller non-government organisations. Smaller non-government organisations often don't have the resources of the larger organisations to be able to apply for competitive tendering. Small non-government organisations are often really community focused, and when they're actually spending a huge amount of their time managing multiple funding sources, it becomes onerous. I know one service that I worked with, an Aboriginal Community Controlled Health organisation, they had over 100 individual contracts which required them to be reported on. So this then takes time away from individual organisations' capacity to deliver services. What it also means is that contracts in particular are time limited. They could be 1 year, they could be 3 year, they could be 5 year. But this does lead to job insecurity, particularly within the social services system and for social service workers. I've seen this in relation to Hep C sexual and reproductive health workers. So I know at a Commonwealth level, there was a focus on Hep C, particularly when there was a cure for Hep C, so this new drug that came in. And there was a government inquiry about how to roll this out, how to actually make sure that everyone that needed it got it, because often people with Hep C are not necessarily accessing services that are in a traditional way. But at the same time, the Commonwealth government had insecure funding around sexual and reproductive health workers within the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health sector. So people were leaving their jobs because they had mortgages to pay. But there was 3 months left on the contract, and yet a new contract had yet to be signed. So this job insecurity is a problem, particularly within this sector. And then the staff are adversely impacted by competitive tendering because, again, when we're talking about efficiency and effectiveness, that means cost saving somewhere. And often that comes in terms of wages, job security, and career development. What this means is, particularly with the contract management, there has been some unintended consequences. So a focus on contract management has undermined efficiency of human services and has an impact on quality. And at the same time, there is an increasing complexity of needs for clients, and yet that's not necessarily being met. It is not always profitable to work with a client with complex needs. Limited capacity, as I said, for smaller grassroots community organisations to play a role in the human service delivery, which are often the best place to know what community needs. And they also sometimes, as I said, are challenged when it comes to their advocacy because they can't actually, they are concerned that they will be risking their organisation's funding if they're advocating. Small government organisations, NGOs, are less competitive also because they're smaller, so they can't actually be as efficient with their funding as larger market-based organisations. We know larger organisations can centralise things like people and culture, so HR, they can centralise IT, whereas on a smaller scale, they tend to be more expensive. And there is a decrease in willingness in the NGOs to collaborate due to the competitive nature of funding. And I have seen this myself, particularly in the Aboriginal community-controlled space. So what it does is pits Aboriginal community-controlled health services, for example, against non-Indigenous organisations. And where they used to collaborate, share resources, there now is often a duplication in services being provided, or there is a gap because of the lack of willingness to collaborate. And it does have significant impacts then for the clients on the ground. So that is it from me in relation to this particular lecture. Please ask your tutors any questions, and I really hope that this has helped you put into perspective some of the readings you've done this week. Thank you very much.